Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. In this one, I'm going to be taking a look at the last two characters of this update that I haven't covered, which are Titania and Absorbing Man. I'm doing both these characters in one video just to give you kind of a comparison between the two, since they are sort of similar to one another. For many people that don't pick up all of the uniforms for every update, these two are likely going to be a skip, but for those that already have them, or if you're looking to see how they do, I'm going to be covering how they perform in both PvE and, more specifically, PvP. The first character I'm looking at is Titania, and if you're curious to know what her improvement is from T2 to the Awakening or Transcendence, then make sure to check out the overview video that I did previously, where I covered that, as well as Absorbing Man's improvement there too. Between these two characters, Titania seems to perform better for PvE, as you'll see in a little bit. So if you do want to build her for that, I would probably recommend a CTP of Energy or a CTP of Destruction, because her kit is pretty proc friendly and she doesn't really have guaranteed crit rate, so the rage won't work as well. And besides that, her skills have kind of a semi-long cooldown, meaning you can't spam skills as often to take full advantage of that multi-skill proc that the rage has. Not using a proc for either Absorbing Man or Titania, and both characters have a CTP of regen as well as no artifact. Despite that, I was still able to clear stage 9 of Knull, even with no leadership or support, and with well over 2.5 minutes left. Just to get a better reference point, I also took her into a stage 35 of Knull, but unfortunately I wasn't able to clear the first phase within 2 minutes, which is the indicator that you can complete the stage. I was able to complete the first phase with about 25 seconds left before the cutoff. For those wondering, that's about 20 seconds slower than my clear time with Juggernaut. The rotation that I used for her is fairly simple, but the execution might be a little bit tricky. You basically just do 3 and then cancel into the 4th, which you delay cancel after she kind of hits the ground and a little bit of an AoE bubble starts, and then you go into the 5th skill and just let that play out. From there, you basically use your 2nd skill and then your 1 skill as filler. When you have access to the Awakening skill, you basically use it right after the 3rd skill and cancel it right away. So the rotation would be 3 cancel, 6 cancel, 4 delay cancel, 5. The reason that I said the execution for the rotation might be a little bit tricky is because you have to time your 3rd skill when you believe you're going to take the most damage. So I did mention previously that CTP of Rage might not be the best option for her, but if you want to play her more easily, you can do 3 and then cancel into the 2nd skill and just stay in that while you're accumulating damage and the proc goes off, so that you can go into the rest of the rotation. With the Energy or Destruction, however, you can wait in that 3rd skill till you see her counter effect activate, where she will begin to swing her hammer, and then you can cancel and go into the rest of the skills. Absorbing Man, on the other hand, is definitely less tricky to play, but he doesn't seem as good as Titania, at least for PvE. On stage 9 alone, I was almost over 40 seconds slower than Titania's clear time. On stage 35, I was barely able to make that first phase cutoff, finishing with just 5 seconds to spare. Despite this, if you do want to build the character for PvE, you can go with something like an Energy or Destruction, since his skills are kind of proc friendly, but you do have to keep in mind that the 3rd skill has to be delayed cancel, and the hits from that might cause your proc to not activate on the skills that you want. So for that reason, you might want to consider something like a CTP of Rage, despite the fact that he doesn't have guaranteed crit rate in his kit. The rotation for Absorbing Man is to use 3 and then delay cancel after he hits the ground with the hammer, then go into the 5th skill, which you very slightly delay cancel after he goes up in the air and starts doing all the hammer through the ground attacks, and then you just go into the 4th skill. Following that, you just let the 2nd play through and the 1st as filler, and then go back into the rotation. Once you have your Awakening skill, you use it right after the delay cancel of the 3rd skill and follow the rest of your rotation like before. So it would be 3, delay cancel, 6, cancel, 5, slight delay cancel, 4. I took the characters into the first phase of Giant Boss Raid Dormammu as well, on the day where they had a type advantage, and it basically confirmed my results that Titania had a better performance in PvE, since she was able to clear the first phase in about 2 minutes, or a little bit over 2 minutes, whereas Absorbing Man was about 30 seconds behind Titania. Also, if you're wondering how Juggernaut compares to these two, if you watched the previous video, you would know that he finished the first phase in about a minute and 40 to a minute and 50 seconds, meaning that he was the fastest of the three. And I suspect that that's mostly because it's a lot easier to accumulate damage with him with his third skill, since you can move around and fill up the damage accumulation meter or buff that way. Whereas for Titania, it's a little bit tougher, and for Absorbing Man, you obviously have to deal damage, you don't accumulate it, and it seems that that isn't working as well as the other two. Even though the characters aren't necessarily game breaking in PvE, they might have some use for your account, such as for AVX, since Titania can be used for the Combat Female Day, not only as a leadership and a support, but can also deal a good amount of damage, and she does have paralysis and burn in her kit, but doesn't have silence. Even though Titania and Juggernaut perform better in PvE, in Alliance Battle Extreme at least, Absorbing Man seems to perform on par with Juggernaut. My guess is that this is probably because you can spam his skills more frequently, and because his damage accumulation is for damage dealt, so you don't really have to worry about taking damage, you can just spam through all of your skills, whereas for Juggernaut you kind of have to wait a little bit to time your skills in order to get the maximum amount of damage from them. Similar to Titania, Absorbing Man is missing one of the cancel effects for one of the seasons, so he has paralysis and silence but is missing burn, whereas like I mentioned before, Titania is missing that silence effect. Now, even though Titania is the better option for PvE, in PvP, however, that is a different story. Now, I'm not saying she's bad, since she does have some good things in her kit, such as the increased health from her uniform passive, as well as having up to 60% penetration on her fourth skill, and having about 70% chance to miss from the opponent when she uses her third skill. In addition to that, the third skill also does have an iframe ignore counter, which Absorbing Man doesn't have any iframe ignore at all, so that is a definitely plus, since she isn't just standing there versus opponents who have a lot of iframes. Her AI rotation isn't really too bad either. She usually opens up with the fifth skill, which gives you that damage buff across all of your skills, as well as leaving a strong AoE effect on the ground. She then usually follows with her fourth skill or her third skill if the opponent goes into an iframe. All of this is good because those are her three best skills. However, the issue is that the character is inconsistent. Sometimes she can easily take out Thanos or even Spider-Man, whereas other times she might just die right away to them. This is largely due to the way that her healing mechanic works, because it's based on a 45% chance of getting hit. So sometimes she can heal a lot and stay alive for a good amount of time, taking out the opponent and stacking up her skills, her damage accumulation, her counter skill, her penetration, but other times she gets no heal and just instantly dies. Besides that, her skill priority is low, meaning that a lot of times her skills can potentially be cancelled, and she'll just end up using her first or second skill. To add to that, the third skill is also very slow even as a counter skill, which oftentimes will get you killed since it does very low damage. The build that I would recommend for her if you do want to use her in PvP is a CTP of Regen. CTP of Authority could also work, but because we don't really know how the accumulation from the Authority and the accumulation from her kit interact, you might potentially nerf her damage by using a CTP of Authority. The Regen also tends to synergize better with her kit, since she does have a little bit higher health from that uniform passive, and despite the heal being on a proc, you also get to boost that as well. I didn't really get to test this, but because the Regen and Authority probably doesn't add too much to her survival because it's so dependent on the proc for the heal to activate, the alternative option that I would go with is a CTP of Greed, since you want to burst down the opponent faster than they can do the same to you. Oddly enough, even though Absorbing Man didn't have an iframe ignore, I found that he was more consistent and performed better overall compared to Titania. One of the reasons for this is because Absorbing Man pretty much has the opposite of what Titania has. Instead of having an inconsistent heal, he has a heal across all of his skills, and if you're using his artifact, which I'm not, you also get an additional heal when you're reflecting physical damage. Besides Absorbing Man having a very consistent heal, he also has a really important effect which really helps his survival, and that is guaranteed dodge rate. Oftentimes you'll see that the opponent will go into iframe and Absorbing Man can't really attack, but even after the damage that they deal, Absorbing Man will still be left standing because he'll usually dodge most of the hits. In addition to this, he does have pretty high skill priority, which actually works really well with the heal on all of his skills, since even if his skills get cancelled, he'll be able to attack first and get the heal from it. Not only that, but most of his main skills are iframes, and the fourth and second skill, which he usually uses after some of his other skills, do have super guard break, meaning that he'll lock down the opponent while the other skills are stacked on. His AI rotation is also pretty good, since he usually opens with the fifth skill right away, which keeps him in a long iframe and protects him, and then often follows up with the fourth skill, which again has that super guard break penetration, as well as giving him invincible and keeping him in another iframe. From there, he'll usually go into his third skills if both those other skills are down, and then if all three of those skills are down, he'll go into his second skill, which is also quite good because it's a very quick attack and also has that super guard break. The only real negatives with the character is that he doesn't have an iframe ignore, which can be problematic versus some of the characters that do deal a lot more damage when they're in their iframes. Also, he doesn't have penetration natively in his kit, so versus opponents that iframe and also have a lot of invincible, it can be tough to take them out as well. Despite this, I would still recommend building the character with a CTP of regeneration first and foremost, because he gets a really big HP increase with his awakening or transcendence, and because he gets a heal across basically every skill and the artifact, meaning that with the recovery rate from the regen, you can basically double that amount from 6 to 12% every time a skill is cast. I found that this gave the best survival option since it worked very similar to Juggernaut, making the character survive all the way up to the awakening skill and getting penetration from that. Going for a CTP of destruction could also work, but again, similar to Juggernaut, it would really hurt his survival, meaning that you might not get too much value out of it. A CTP of Authority is likely a solid option as well if you don't have a regen or if you have kind of low health, such as under 40% on your cards. However, I did test an Invincible Obelisk, which is somewhat similar to an Authority, not exactly, and I did find that a regen was the better option, even without penetration on it. I'm currently using one that provides attack and defense, since I wanted to boost up his damage and his reflect. But you can see that he is pretty consistent most of the times, since he is able to take out characters like Sentry, Doom, Thanos, and Spider-Man without dying right away. Without having an iframe ignore, he's obviously not going to have any place in timeline, but if you do play Alliance Conquest, then he'll be a solid addition to your roster. Speaking of Alliance Conquest, I also did test both of them there. However, I did include them together on the same team, since I didn't really feel they had enough in their kit to be able to solo by themselves. This team seemed to work pretty well for countering strong speed or combat types, since Titania provides that iframe ignore counter and penetration for Absorbing Man, as well as buffing up his reflect and damage with that leadership and support passive. You can see from the past two clips that Titania usually ends up having the lower health or dying from the two, but in some cases she ends up performing better, and in this clip in particular, she ends up wiping the whole other team. Like I mentioned, she is inconsistent, but that doesn't mean she is bad. When her kit does end up performing properly and proccing, she can perform some pretty great things. I almost forgot to mention that both characters also have super armor, so if you don't have a regen or authority, you could probably make a CTP of Transcendence work as well. All in all though, it's difficult to recommend these characters for anything outside of Alliance Conquest. For most players, Titania is the better value for things like ABX and having another leadership and support, but for Alliance Conquest specifically, Absorbing Man seems to be the most consistent option. However, when you take everything into consideration, Titania will probably give you the most value overall, since you can also get that leadership and support in Alliance Conquest as well, besides having it be useful in PvE content. If you ask me, Titania is basically like a better version of Jessica Jones. But anyways, if you don't really play Alliance Conquest and you don't chase ABX scores, then these two characters won't really add much to your roster. With the character reviews now finished, the next thing that I'll be taking a look at is World Boss Legend Gore, so I'll be providing a guide for that in the following video. As always, if you did enjoy this video, please consider liking and subscribing and sharing this video with other people, since it might help them out as well. I always appreciate people taking the time to watch these, so thank you, but the video is now over.